Hi everyone, it's Jenny. I'm here to do the reflection that we're supposed to do, answer some questions. So the first question is make connections among the films, documentaries, and books. What are the common threads? One of the biggest common threads that I saw was the power and privilege of the dominant class that was talked about in all the movies and all the books that we read. I think one of the big privileges that we have as a dominant class that maybe we don't think about is that we're represented everywhere. Everywhere we look, we see ourselves, we see people that look like us, people in power look like us, in our schools, at our work, on TV, in books, in politics, everywhere we go, we're represented. And that's not the case for the people that aren't in the dominant class. Even in the toys we buy for our kids, um, I know that I was shopping for my friend's her daughter's birthday and I wanted to get her a baby doll. And so I went to Toys R Us and I was looking for a black baby doll for her and there weren't any. I'm sure if you went to a I don't know, maybe a bigger town or a independent store, you could find them on Amazon, etc. But just going to a large chain toy store, every single baby doll in the aisle was white. And maybe most people wouldn't even notice that. It wouldn't be on their radar, but it's a problem when everywhere you go, you're not represented and you're not seen, and that can affect you personally. I noticed that in Inequality for All when it was talking about, the politicians that make our laws and our policies, the richest 1%, the people in the banking industry, the people that are creating our policies, that are the corporations that are buying policies, all of these people are part of the dominant class. They're white, male, upper class, heterosexual, able bodied people. In our book, Leadership for Social Justice, Mary Mack, one of the people from the 5th chapter, she was talking about how when she was teaching in a first grade classroom, she was teaching a social studies lesson about community helpers, and every single person in the book was white, even though her class was mainly black, Hispanic. Um, there weren't white students in her class, but that was all that was represented in the book. So she went out and she took her own pictures of, a black policeman, a black firefighter, a black pilot, and brought those into class in order to show her kids. But that's another example of the minorities, anyone not in the dominant class, not being shown, not being represented in our schools and our curriculum. In the book I read, which was Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, Beverly Tatum mentioned that one reason you see that is because people like to spend time with other people that look like them. They like to be able to share experiences, be able to talk to someone that knows what they're going through without having to explain it, especially in cases of racism. And so, in places like the cafeteria or outside of work, black people gather together so that they have that, because unlike white people or the dominant class, they don't have that everywhere they go. They're not just seeing people that look like them in all aspects of their lives. And another thing Beverly Tatum mentioned was that without positive role models or being represented everywhere, black kids can often develop a poor self image of themselves, and that can result in internalized depression. And in Leadership for Social Justice, it asked a question, who am I? And the answer was, who the world around me says I am. So when you're not seeing yourself in the world around you, who does that leave you to believe that you are? And this was something else that I noticed in Ruby Bridges, the movie that I watched, that after she started going to her new school, the white school, where people were always yelling at her when she was walking inside, they were calling her names. They told her she wasn't wanted there. She internalized some of that, and her psychologist asked her to draw a picture of herself and her family and people in her life. And she drew all the black people as incomplete. They were missing, their mouths or different body parts. But then the white people that she drew, like her psychologist and her teacher, were all drawn perfectly. So that was an example of her internalizing how the world around her is seeing her. So I think we need to be very aware of that when we're teaching, when we're speaking to kids, being aware of how they're seeing themselves and what we're doing to make that more equitable. Another theme that I noticed was education. So in all the movies and all the books, education is mentioned. And Inequality for All mentioned that education is a big key toward upward mobility. I think all of the books really mention that in some form or another. In Ruby Bridges, her mom fought for her to go to this better school so that she could get a better education and have a better life, even though it meant her daughter being scared, being yelled at, being so afraid she was going to be poisoned that she stopped eating. Her father lost his job. They lost friends. They weren't welcome in certain stores anymore. There were a whole lot of repercussions. But because education is so important, her mom made her go to this school because it was worth all of that. So all of these sources talk about how important education is. But another thing they talk about is that our education system doesn't support minorities, that we don't provide an equal education, which is a real problem since education is such an important aspect in how we can get out of our situations. Beverly Tatum, in Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting in the Cafeteria Together, mentioned that Native Americans aren't represented in our school books, in our curriculum. If they are represented at all, it's only in the past. There's no modern images of them. Biracial children are rarely represented in books, in our media. Latino and Hispanic children, a big problem with that is that language is such a big, important part of their culture. And then when they go to school, they're told, not to speak in their native language. They're even pressured to not speak it at home. They're just supposed to speak English all the time. And when you go into school not knowing any English, it's going to be a lot harder for you to learn. It's the book said that it takes 5 to 6 years to master the English language enough for the level that you would need to be successful in school. So if we're not allowing those children to use their native language at school at all, I don't know how we expect them to be successful. And then she also mentioned Black people are only shown in our curriculum basically during slavery, and then maybe other times like Black History Month. But that, again, that's just one time in our curriculum. That's having it more as an add-on and it's not embedded. So that was another major theme that I noticed in our books and the movies. The next question was, what does it mean to lead for social justice within a school, school policy, school practices, curriculum, pedagogy? I think that it means to work every day to ensure that every student is getting the best education that they possibly can. One way of doing this is being critical of the current school policies and practices. And one way to look at that is to do an equity audit that was mentioned in Leadership for Social Justice, to look at the assignment of kids to special education classes, to gifted classes, the discipline referrals, the ability grouping that kids are put in, their class placement. Look at all of these things and see how they're affected by race, gender, class, etc. And then once you get those results, if it shows that it's not equitable, doing everything you can, working to make that more equitable. I think one way to do that is to start these discussions with your staff. In the schools I've worked in, none of this stuff has ever been talked about. So, using professional developments and trainings to talk about your own biases that you have, talk about your identity, to start these discussions, then teachers are going to start thinking about these things, and that's going to translate into the curriculum, into their teaching, into them being passionate about social justice. So to lead for social justice within a school, I think it's really important to start these conversations with our staff and with our students. And then a couple of the problems that were cited in Leadership for Social Justice of why this isn't happening, even when it became a mandate, was that, teachers lacked commitment or interest in it. and also that they didn't have the training or the knowledge to do it. So I think both of these problems could be solved by making this a daily discussion with our teachers in our schools, and how important it is. With regards to curriculum, I think as social justice leaders, it's important that we make sure that every group is represented all the time throughout our curriculum, and that it's not an add-on, that it is embedded. One thing that Beverly Tatum mentioned was that in school, when we learn about Black leaders, we only hear about people like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks. You hear about the same people over and over and over, when really we should be learning about, Black people, well, not just the prominent ones, but everyone. And we should be learning about them throughout our curriculum, not just in those cases. And we should also be aware of just everything throughout our schools, how we're representing our students and their different cultures. Is everyone shown on the posters that we have up? The speakers we're bringing in to talk to our students, the field trips we're going on, the lessons we're teaching, the books that we're reading, the movies we're showing, everything. That as leaders for social justice, we just have to really be aware of the message that we're sending our students, and we want everyone to feel included. And one way that we can make this happen is to observe teachers in the classroom and observe them teaching. See, what they're teaching, how they're reacting to certain students. Are they using varied approaches in teaching and assessment to reach everyone, or are they using a cookie cutter model? And then based on your observations, using the strengths and weaknesses that you see, incorporating those into your professional developments, to start to address those issues. The third question was, to what extent does your campus/district afford teachers and children with opportunities to discuss race, ethnicity, class, religion, beliefs, faith, gender, sexual identity, diverse families, ability, immigration status, native language, and family structure? Why or why not? I'm not currently teaching, so I'm just going to talk about a couple schools that I've worked in the past. I've mainly taught preschool and pre-K, but I've never discussed these things in the schools I've worked in. It's never been a topic among the staff. It's never been included in professional development. It's never been included in any trainings. And it's not really a part of the curriculum. The only time I'd say that it is mentioned is during specific times like Black History Month. One school I worked in, during morning assembly, whatever teacher or grade was leading morning assembly for that day had to give a fact about Black history or talk about, a prominent leader. And that's great. But again, that was for Black History Month. So that was only 1 month, and then it wasn't talked about again. The only other way these issues were ever brought up was if they were teacher initiated. So I did, we had to teach a unit on family. And in the school I taught in, the curriculum was pre-written. So, the books that we had to read, the poems we had to read, the songs we sang, everything was already written out for us. Even what we were supposed to say was scripted, which just wasn't my way of teaching, so I didn't really go off of that. I followed it to the point that I had to. But in the family unit, I realized that not all families were represented. So I went online, I found pictures, and I brought in the pictures when I introduced the unit, and I showed all different kinds of families. 2 moms, 2 dads, 1 mom, 1 dad, families with adopted children, step families, children living with their grandparents, extended families, biracial families. I'm just, every different family I could think of. Because we have to be aware of that. Even if those kids aren't represented in our class, we should still include it because it's still a part of our world. So like that year, I didn't have any students that had 2 moms or 2 dads, but that should still be included in our curriculum. And in doing that unit, there was also a poem that we were supposed to read to the students, and it talked about, the mom staying home and the dad going off to work, and it said something about how all family members look alike. And I refused to read that to my students because it just seemed very outdated to me, and not all family members do look alike. I have 2 adopted brothers from Korea, and they don't look like me, but they're still part of my family. So I made a decision not to read that poem, and I found another poem that was more up to date and more representative of what I think we should be including in our curriculum to represent everybody. But other than that, these issues really weren't discussed in the schools that I've worked in. And the last question was, what role do you play in promoting culturally responsive work, such as the work noted above? What role do you play in promoting social justice work in schools? To what extent does cultural responsiveness and social justice work overlap? Why or why not? As a teacher, I think that we play a huge role in promoting culturally responsive work. We're the ones that need to make sure that our students are represented in the books we read and everything we do, like I just talked about. The way that we decorate our rooms, the littlest things to the biggest things, the homework we send home, the events we have. So when I was teaching, if we were going to learn about the holidays, we were going to talk about all the holidays. We were going to talk about Christmas. We were going to talk about Kwanzaa. We were going to talk about Hanukkah. And then I always invited the families in, because I think that's a big part of teaching for social justice and culturally responsive work, is including families and community. So I invited families in to talk about their holiday traditions. I had a parent that came in and taught the students the dreidel game. I had a parent that came in and sang Christmas songs. A personal holiday tradition of mine when I was growing up was that we wore traditional Korean outfits when we decorated the tree, because I have 2 adopted brothers from Korea. So I brought in those outfits and I let the students try those on, and that led to more learning. They had questions: where is Korea? What language do they speak? What foods do they eat? Etc., etc. So including this kind of work leads to more learning opportunities and more questions, and that's really what education should be about. Another example is when we did a lesson on a community, I invited parents in again to share with the kids their jobs, to teach them about what jobs they did. We also talked about housing, so I made sure, not just to say draw a picture of your house, because not everyone lives in a house. So we talked about you can live in a house, in an apartment, and in a trailer, all the different places you can live, and made sure that that was all represented in our lessons. Another example of teaching for social justice or promoting culturally responsive work is, and the things we send home in our newsletters, in our calendars, in our homework, in our announcements. We need to make sure that every family is able to read what we're sending home. So I worked in a school with a lot of Hispanic families, a lot of parents that didn't speak any English, couldn't read any English. So I had to make sure that I was translating these documents so that they could get the information I needed them to receive. And to do this, I worked with different people. I utilized our Spanish teacher, or I had several parents in my classroom that were fluent in English and Spanish. I'd have them translate. I had a Mandarin family, so for them I used the language line and used that to translate. So you just have to think, outside the box a little and make sure that you're reaching everybody. And you shouldn't really view it as extra work, because it's not extra work to write the newsletter to send home for the English-speaking families. So it shouldn't be extra work to send the newsletter home to the families that don't speak English. It just should be something that's done. So I think those are examples of the roles that we play in promoting culturally responsive work and promoting social justice. And I think the two overlap a lot, because when we're incorporating our students' culture into everything that we're doing, we're teaching for social justice, because we're making sure that every student is getting the best education that they can. We're making the learning equitable. So I think the two overlap a lot. So just to end it, I think that our schools still have a really long way to go But just the fact that we're learning these things in our class, the classes that we're taking to prepare ourselves to become administrators, and that we're having these discussions, we're headed in the right direction. So people like ourselves that are learning this stuff, we just need to make sure that we're going out of there and we're incorporating it into our teaching, into our schools, into our leading, and that we're talking about it to everyone, to our friends, to people we run into on the street, because that's the only way that the awareness is going to grow and that things are going to change.